May 8th, 1945. Germany has fallen. The Reich that promised 1,000 years has crumbled in just 12. But across the smoking ruins of Central Europe, a different kind of battle is underway. Not for territory, but for survival. 180,000 German soldiers are running. Not from bullets, not from bombs, but from a choice that will determine whether they live or disappear forever into the frozen darkness of the Soviet gulag. This is the story of the largest mass surrender you've never heard about, and the desperate race to reach American lines before Stalin's Red Army could claim them first. To understand why nearly 200,000 men would choose captivity over continuing to fight, we need to rewind the clock just slightly to the spring of 1945, when Nazi Germany was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. By April, the Reich was a nation only in name. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. Soviet armies stood at the gates of Berlin. German cities that once symbolized industrial might, Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, were now graveyards of ash and rubble. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, had been reduced to a handful of planes flown by teenage boys with barely enough fuel to take off. But the Wehrmacht, Germany's armed forces, still numbered in the millions, battle-hardened divisions, elite panzer units, paratroopers who had fought from Crete to Caen. And yet, something had fundamentally shifted. Hitler's orders from his bunker beneath Berlin grew increasingly detached from reality. Fight to the last man, he commanded. No retreat, no surrender. But his soldiers knew better. They had seen what happened on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front wasn't just a battlefield. It was a charnel house, a meat grinder that had consumed entire armies. From 1941 to 1945, nearly 4 million German soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured fighting the Soviet Union. But it was the fate of prisoners that truly haunted every Wehrmacht soldier. German POWs taken by the Soviets simply vanished. Of approximately 3 million captured during the war, nearly 1 million would never return home. They disappeared into a vast network of labor camps, stretching from the Urals to Siberia, the gulag system. There, they would work in conditions that made death a daily probability. Freezing temperatures, starvation rations, brutal labor quotas in mines, forests, and construction projects. The stories that did filter back were nightmarish. Men forced to work 16-hour days in sub-zero cold, prisoners dying of dysentery, typhus, and simple exhaustion. Some camps had mortality rates exceeding 50%. For many German soldiers, capture by the Soviets wasn't seen as the end of the war, it was seen as a death sentence with extra steps. And there was another factor: revenge. The German invasion of the Soviet Union had been apocalyptic in its brutality. 27 million Soviet citizens had died. Entire villages had been burned. Leningrad had been starved. Wehrmacht and SS units had participated in atrocities that defied comprehension. The Red Army soldiers advancing into the stories that did filter back were nightmarish. Men forced to work 16-hour days in sub-zero cold. Prisoners dying of dysentery, typhus, and simple exhaustion. Some camps had mortality rates exceeding 50%. For many German soldiers, captured by the Soviets wasn't seen as the end of the war. It was seen as a death sentence with extra steps. And there was another factor: revenge. The German invasion of the Soviet Union had been apocalyptic in its brutality. 27 million Soviet citizens had died. Entire villages had been burned. Leningrad had been starved. Wehrmacht and SS units had participated in atrocities that defied comprehension. The Red Army soldiers advancing into Germany in 1945 hadn't forgotten. They carried with them a burning desire for retribution. It was a race against time, and the prize was life itself. By mid-April 1945, the map of Germany told a story of inevitable collapse. From the west, General Eisenhower's forces had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into the German heartland. Patton's Third Army was racing through Bavaria. British forces were pushing toward Hamburg and the North German plain. From the east, Marshal Zhukov's forces were encircling Berlin, while Konev's army swept through Saxony. The two juggernauts were scheduled to meet somewhere in central Germany, creating what would become the dividing line between Soviet and Western occupation zones. This created a crucial window of opportunity. German units east of this projected meeting point had a limited time to move west before the trap snapped shut. Once the Americans and Soviets linked up, there would be no crossing the line. Any German soldier caught on the Soviet side would remain there, likely for years, possibly forever. Several major German formations were particularly well positioned to exploit this opportunity. Army Group Center, under Ferdinand Schörner, a fanatical Nazi loyalist known for his brutal discipline and unwavering loyalty to Hitler. In late April 1945, Schörner commanded approximately 900,000 troops in Czechoslovakia and Eastern Germany. On paper, this was still a formidable force, but the reality was far different. Many units existed only on maps. Others were composed of teenagers, old men, and foreign volunteers of dubious reliability. Fuel was critically short. Ammunition was scarce. Air cover was non-existent. Yet Schörner continued to issue orders for offensive operations. He established flying courts-martials that hanged defeatists from lampposts. He demanded that his subordinates hold every position to the last man. He was, in essence, exactly the kind of commander Hitler wanted, and exactly the kind who would get thousands of men killed for no strategic purpose. But below Schörner's level, the Wehrmacht officer corps was quietly organizing a rebellion, not of weapons, but of feet. Division and corps commanders began implementing what they called elastic defense, a euphemism for retreating as slowly as possible while fighting just hard enough to avoid SS intervention.
The goal was transparent: move west. Every day of fighting withdrawal brought them closer to American lines and further from Soviet encirclement. Officers whispered about the locations of American spearheads. Plans were made. Routes were scouted. And when the moment came, when it was finally clear that Germany had lost, these units would make their break for the West. That moment arrived on May 8, 1945, when Germany officially surrendered. But for Army Group Center and dozens of other formations, the war wasn't over. Their private war, the war for survival, was just beginning. When the official surrender came, the response from German units facing the Soviets was not compliance, but panic. Entire divisions began moving west without orders. Soldiers abandoned heavy equipment. Trucks were loaded with wounded. Horse-drawn wagons carried civilians desperate to escape the Red Army. The roads toward American lines became choked with humanity, a river of fear flowing westward. The Americans, advancing from the opposite direction, began encountering something they hadn't anticipated. Not resistance, but mass surrender. German formations, sometimes entire divisions, would send officers forward under white flags, requesting permission to surrender to American forces. The scale was staggering. Near the Elbe River, thousands of German soldiers crossed daily, overwhelming American processing capabilities. In Bavaria and Austria, Wehrmacht units bypassed rear-echelon American troops to surrender directly to frontline formations, believing they would be better treated by combat soldiers who understood military honor. General William Simpson's Ninth Army, positioned along the Elbe, found itself accepting the surrender of German forces at a rate of 10,000 men per day. Further south, Patton's Third Army was similarly inundated. American commanders faced logistical nightmares. Where do you house
feed, and guard tens of thousands of prisoners when your supply lines are already stretched thin. But the Americans made it work. POW camps were established in open fields. German officers were often allowed to maintain internal discipline within their units. Food and medical supplies were diverted. It wasn't generous, it was pragmatic. Better to accept surrender than to drive desperate men back toward Soviet lines, where they might resume fighting. The Soviets, watching from the eastern bank of the Elbe, were furious. According to agreements at Yalta, German forces were supposed to surrender to whichever Allied power they faced. These mass movements west violated the spirit, if not the letter, of Allied coordination. Stalin complained to Churchill and Roosevelt. Soviet officers demanded that Germans east of designated lines be turned over to Red Army custody. The Americans, caught between diplomatic obligations and human sympathy, largely looked the other way. If German soldiers could reach their lines before the Soviets arrived, they were processed as American prisoners. It was, in essence, a tacit acknowledgement that not all Allied armies were equal in the eyes of those surrendering. This mass movement wasn't limited to combat units. German civilians, millions of them, were also fleeing west. Women, children, elderly residents of East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania had already experienced what happened when the Red Army arrived: mass violence, looting, displacement. They knew that the eastern territories of Germany would be annexed by Poland and the Soviet Union. Anyone caught there would be expelled if they survived at all.
So the roads west carried not just soldiers, but an entire civilization in retreat. Families with handcarts, refugees with nothing but the clothes on their backs. It was one of the largest population movements in European history, driven by one simple motivation: get to the Western Allies before the Soviets arrive. The Soviet reaction to this mass westward flight was predictable: outrage mixed with ruthless pragmatism. Stalin viewed the German preference for American captivity as both a practical problem and an ideological insult. These were men who had invaded his country, destroyed his cities, killed his people. By rights of combat and suffering, he believed they belonged in Soviet custody to rebuild what they had destroyed, to pay with their labor for their crimes. Soviet commanders issued orders to intercept German columns attempting to reach American lines. In some cases, retreating Wehrmacht units found themselves caught between advancing Soviet forces and distant American positions, forced to fight one final time, not to win, but simply to create enough space for their comrades to escape. There were instances of tragedy and chaos. Some German units, cut off from westward routes, attempted to negotiate surrender to Soviet forces and were met with brutal treatment. Officers were separated and often never seen again. Enlisted men were loaded onto trains heading east, beginning journeys that would last years. In Czechoslovakia, the situation was particularly complex. Czech partisans had risen up against German occupation in the Prague Uprising, beginning on May 5th. Wehrmacht units caught between Czech resistance, Soviet forces, and their own desperation to reach American lines fought chaotic street battles while simultaneously trying to withdraw westward. Some units negotiated temporary ceasefires with Czech fighters, promising to withdraw peacefully if allowed to pass. Others fought savagely, knowing they had nothing to lose. General Patton's Third Army, advancing into western Czechoslovakia, was explicitly ordered to halt and not advance to Prague, allowing Soviet forces to liberate the Czech capital for political reasons. This left thousands of German soldiers in limbo, too far east to reach American lines before the Soviets arrived. Their fate was sealed. But for those who made it, for those 180,000 who successfully reached American or British custody, the gamble had paid off. They would spend months or years in POW camps, true. Many would not return home until 1948 or later, but they would return. They would see their families again. They would rebuild their lives.
Their comrades who fell into Soviet hands would not be so fortunate. Of the nearly 2 million German POWs in Soviet custody at war's end, the last prisoners were not released until 1956, 11 years after the war ended. Thousands died in captivity. The survivors returned home as broken men, aged beyond their years, to a Germany that had moved on without them. The choice to surrender west rather than east was, for most German soldiers, the most important decision of their lives. And the fact that 180,000 made that choice successfully speaks to a combination of luck, timing, and sheer desperation. Behind the statistics, behind the numbers like 180,000, were individual human stories. Men who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Lieutenant Heinrich Boll, who would later become a Nobel Prize-winning author, was among those who surrendered to American forces in the war's final days. In his later writings, he described the surreal experience of the surrender, the relief mixed with shame, the hunger and exhaustion, but most of all, the overwhelming sense of having survived against all odds. Other soldiers left diaries and letters describing the final march west. One corporal wrote, "We walked for 3 days without stopping. Men collapsed by the roadside. We left them, there was no choice. Every hour counted. Behind us we could hear artillery, Russian artillery, getting closer. When we finally saw American uniforms, grown men wept." For many German soldiers, surrender to the Americans involved a complex mixture of emotions. There was relief, certainly, but also humiliation. These were men who had been told they were racially superior, that they were building a 1,000-year empire. Now they stood with hands raised, defeated, reduced to begging for mercy from the very people they had been taught to despise.
Yet, in many cases, they found that American soldiers treated them with a rough but genuine humanity. Combat veterans understood that soldiers on both sides had been following orders, had been fighting for survival. There was little sympathy for the Nazi cause, but there was a soldier's recognition of shared experience. One American sergeant recalled, "They came in thousands, just kept coming. Some of them could barely walk. We gave them water, sat them down, took their weapons. One kid couldn't have been more than 16, asked me in broken English if we were going to shoot him. I told him no. He just sat down and cried." These moments of human connection couldn't erase the war's horrors. They couldn't undo the Holocaust, the destroyed cities, the millions dead. But they represented something important, the possibility that even after the most total war in history, there could be something other than revenge. There could be, however imperfect, a return to treating enemies as human beings rather than monsters. For the soldiers who made it to American lines, this treatment was the first sign that their gamble had succeeded. They were prisoners, yes, but they were alive. And in the spring of 1945, for a German soldier, that was miracle enough. The mass surrender of German forces to the Western Allies in May 1945 had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate question of prisoner logistics. First, it revealed a fundamental truth about the Nazi state. Ideology was skin deep. When the choice came between dying for Hitler's fantasy or surviving in American captivity, even soldiers who had fought for 6 years chose survival. The 1,000-year Reich collapsed not just militarily, but psychologically. Soldiers voted with their feet, and they voted against everything the regime had claimed to represent. Second, it exposed tensions within the Allied coalition that would define the coming Cold War. The Soviet Union's fury at being denied German prisoners was an early indication that Eastern and Western allies had very different visions for post-war Europe. The Iron Curtain that Churchill would famously describe in 1946 was already visible in May 1945, traced along the lines where German soldiers chose to surrender.
Third, it raised profound questions about military honor and duty. German officers who ordered their men to march west were technically violating orders. They were disobeying Hitler's commands to fight to the last. Yet in doing so, they saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Does obedience to an evil regime constitute honor, or does it make you complicit in evil? The German officers who chose their men's lives over ideological loyalty were making a moral calculation that German society would grapple with for decades. Fourth, the differential treatment of POWs by Soviet and American forces validated the German choice in the most brutal terms. The soldiers who surrendered west went home. The soldiers captured by the Soviets largely did not, at least not for years. This created a permanent divide in German memory, those who survived because they surrendered to Americans, and those who suffered because they fell into Soviet hands. Finally, this episode highlights something often forgotten about World War II's end. It didn't end at the same time for everyone. Yes, May 8th was VE Day, victory in Europe. But for German soldiers, for millions of refugees, for POWs, the war continued for years in different forms. Their war was about survival, about getting home, about somehow building a life after everything they had known had been destroyed. The 180,000 German soldiers who successfully surrendered to American forces were the lucky ones. They had made the right choice at the right time. They had read the strategic situation correctly. They had, in many cases, defied orders and risked execution by their own side to save themselves and their men. They were not heroes. Many had participated in or enabled terrible crimes, but they were human beings making human calculations in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. And their choice to seek American captivity rather than Soviet capture became one of the defining micro-narratives of World War II's chaotic ending. War is often presented as a story of heroes and villains, of clear moral choices and decisive battles. But the story of the 180,000 German soldiers who chose American captivity over Soviet capture reminds us that the end of war is rarely clean or simple. These men were not making a choice between good and evil. They were making a choice between two different futures, both uncertain, both involving captivity and punishment, but one offering the chance of survival and one offering likely death. In that moment, stripped of ideology and propaganda, facing the consequences of a war their nation had started and lost, they made the most human choice possible. They chose life. This doesn't absolve them of responsibility for the war's horrors. It doesn't erase the crimes committed in Germany's name. But it does remind us that even in history's darkest chapters, individual human beings still faced individual choices, and those choices mattered. The Western Allies, by accepting these mass surrenders despite Soviet protests, also made a choice. They chose a kind of rough mercy over strict justice. They chose to see German soldiers as human beings rather than simply as enemies to be punished. This choice, too, had consequences. It helped create the conditions for German reconstruction, for reconciliation, for the Germany that would emerge as a democratic ally rather than a permanent enemy. Today, the battlefields where these surrenders took place are quiet. The POW camps are long gone. The men who made this desperate march west are mostly dead now, their stories fading into history. But their choice and its consequences helped shape the Europe we know today. In the end, the story of these 180,000 German soldiers is about a simple truth that transcends any individual war. When given the choice between hope and despair, between possible survival and certain death, human beings will always choose hope, even in defeat, even in shame, even when that hope requires surrendering to yesterday's enemy. That, perhaps, more than any tale of battlefield glory, is the most human story war can tell.